Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for December 13th, 2021. Well, we're still in the midst of an extremely dangerous strategic situation, which is characterized by the continuing threats coming from London and Washington, and also echoed by the leaders of NATO and the G7 against Russia about their supposedly impending invasion of Ukraine. This has been in the news ever since the collapse of the COP26 conference, or to cover up the failure to force everyone to accept the giving up of sovereignty to the fake science of climate change. They're now moving toward a new crisis, trying to bring about a unity of the so-called democracies against Russia and China. And this has been amplified by the claim that the Russians have troops poised to invade Ukraine by the end of January or early February. There was a summit December 7th, a video summit between Putin and Biden to discuss this. And while there was certain progress made, the fact that they're talking, there are working groups engaged in dialogue. At the same time, you have meetings such as the G7 foreign ministers meeting this last weekend, where they sent out, again, the same belligerent signals. They condemned the Russian buildup, even though there are now acknowledgments that it's not 180,000 or 250,000 troops on the border, but 70,000. And is Russia not entitled to have troops on Russian territory? Well, the line is that it's not just Russian troops, that they are preparing to invade. The foreign ministers threatened massive consequences, economic consequences, if Russia invaded. Blinken, the hypocritical U.S. Secretary of State, said, quote, "One country can't dictate to another its choices," unquote. Well, isn't that what the U.S. has done since 2001? Repeatedly telling countries, you must accept the rules that we make in the so-called rules-based order, or you'll be overthrown and there'll be a war. Over and over, we've done that. So who are we to dictate to Russia that they can't move forces in their own country? Now, also, this was backed up by military shipments of Javelin anti-tank missile launchers to Ukraine, with more weaponry promised. At the foreign ministers meeting, the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss met with Blinken, where they joined hands in a belligerent threat against Russia. Interesting that this is that she's out front now, pushing this at a point at which Boris Johnson's government is teetering, facing one scandal after another. Isn't that typical? You face a crisis at home, and instead you bring up another boogeyman of another country. That's exactly what they're doing. Now then you have Blinken on the way to Southeast Asia, where he claims he will be, quote, "forging a united front against China in the Indo-Pacific," unquote. So you have the idea of a two-front war now, Russia and Ukraine in the Black Sea, China in the Indo-Pacific, the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. military officials have been repeatedly testifying before Congress we're not prepared even for a single war, that we would lose a war to China if China chose to invade Taiwan. So we're going to build up to fight wars in the Indochina, Indo-Pacific region and Ukraine. This is where you see the insanity when we face multiple crises, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Now, Biden himself was asked at a press conference why he took sending ground troops to Ukraine off the table. And he responded simply saying, they never were on the table. He said that we have pledged to Ukraine that we will support them. But he asked the reporter, are you prepared to send U.S. troops to fight a war with Russia in Ukraine, which is what would happen? Now, he did repeat his threats of devastating economic consequences if Russia would invade. And he said the NATO countries are all unified in this. But he also has said that there will be a discussion with NATO allies in Russia about a continued eastward expansion of NATO. Putin objected to that. He objected to it by pointing to the U.S. pledge in 1990 not to move eastward. while the U.S. broke that pledge repeatedly as NATO has added a number of countries in Eastern Europe up to the borders of Russia. So Biden said to Putin that he would bring that up and would set up a meeting with foreign ministers of NATO countries or leaders of NATO countries with Russia, and that also they would discuss the Normandy format, which Ukraine signed but has refused to abide by. And this is where the tension comes in. There are forces of the Ukrainian military in the so-called Azov battalion. The people in that battalion are openly supporters of the neo-Nazi Ukrainian SS that joined with the Nazis during the German occupation of Ukraine in the early 1940s in exterminating Poles, Russians, Romanians, Hungarians, and other non-ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine. Now, the grandsons of that Azov battalion are now marching behind Nazi flags, chanting Nazi slogans about ethnic purity in Ukraine. And that's why the Russian ethnic population of eastern Ukraine rose up in arms to prevent that. And they had some support from Russia. Now the Ukrainian crazies are saying, let's push this. Let's force NATO to come in. Let's attack, send drone attacks into eastern Ukraine. And then if Russia invades, we'll force NATO to back us up. That's not going to happen. NATO can threaten all they want, but the idea of fighting a war with Russia and Ukraine is absurd. As Colonel Douglas MacGregor said, that we would lose that war very quickly. So then you might ask, why is the German government talking about providing German Air Force jets armed with nuclear weapons to protect Ukraine? That's what Annalena Baerbock, the tumbler, the gymnast, who's now the foreign minister of Germany, who's nothing but a mouthpiece for the most bellicose statements from NATO and the Atlantic Council, that's what she's threatening. So in this context, Helga Zepp-LaRouche issued a call titled, "Psychopaths Are Threatening Our Existence. Germany Must Leave NATO." And the point she's making is that if there were to be a war in Ukraine, it would rapidly spread to Germany. That Germany is in the firing line, so to speak, especially if German jets are involved in the attack on Russian troops. And so why would the German government risk this? And so she makes the point in her statement, and by the way, this will be posted at theschillerinstitute.com, and I would urge people to read it, study it, and circulate it. She said, "The real reason for the global military muscle play on multiple fronts is the systemic collapse of the neoliberal system, which they are trying to cover up with a confetti shower of anti-Russian and anti-Chinese narratives." Classic example of changing the subject. You don't want people talking about the fact they can no longer afford energy or food, that we're no longer going to be producing energy in Germany because of the anti-nuclear, anti-coal policies. Instead, they want people to be talking about how Putin is the boogeyman and he's preparing to swallow up all of Europe. What Helga is calling for is people to speak out against this war drive, as Tulsi Gabbard did, as Douglas MacGregor did, as Tucker Carlson did, as Chaz Freeman did when talking about the insanity of provoking a war with China. We need more people who are officials, but we also need a mobilization of average citizens, of people who watch this video daily. Download Helga's statement, read it, study it, circulate it, share it. Encourage people to speak up in whatever venue they have, whether it's a church group, whether it's a parents' association, whether it's a work group, a political party meeting. We need to have an ongoing dialogue about the difference between cooperation on solving economic and other strategic problems as opposed to war. At moments like this, the individual voice is a powerful voice, especially if you speak and organize others. And that's what's needed. no submission to the idea of a rules-based order, where the rules are dictated by the most greedy thieves on the planet, the speculators who run the City of London and Wall Street. Instead, the people must speak out. So join us in doing that, and I'll be back again to update you on this tomorrow.